The title of my presentation is The Divine Gaze, Reflection on Creation and Perception. It really considers the concept whether a robot or avatar can reciprocate the gaze of its creator. Of course, the Judeo-Christian creation story is recorded in Genesis, and humanity is created in God's image. And theologians have interpreted this in different ways, as we heard over the last couple of days. Gerhard von Rad interprets the image as humanity being a representative God on earth, whilst Karl Barth offers a relational view. However, this presentation is not about our understanding the image, but the fact that God gazed on those he had created, or he gazed on his creation. Throughout Genesis 1, we see that God created and saw that it was good, culminating the creation of humanity, which he saw was very good. So we could ask the same questions of robots, avatars, or AI. Are they made in our image to represent us, or even to build a relationship with social robots with us? Was an Alexa created initially in the image of a secretary or a PA to fulfill their role? When I create an avatar in the metaverse, is it a reflection of me, or perhaps who I'd like to be, or perhaps even an opportunity to explore different parts of sexuality, ethnicity, dress sense, or other things? The difficulty with both robots and avatars is around definitions and understandings. We might think a robot is a mechanical human with a similar image to us, but that could also include Google Nest, Alexa, electronic lawnmower, or even a vacuum cleaner. And my friend has named his vacuum cleaner. The difficulty with both robots and avatars is around definition and understanding, as I've just said. But how do we define avatars? Well, I defined it in a piece of work that it's a visible representation of an invisible self. The other avatars cannot see the user, only their avatar, and vice versa. Paula Sweeney talks about AI entities that represent people through large language and multi-models. Danaher and Nihom talk about digital duplicates, which are artificial, at least partial recreations or simulations of real people. So we have all these various understandings. So when we talk, as Anna did yesterday, about avatars, depending which field we sit in, may give us a different interpretation. And of course, as we engage with them, it becomes more difficult. As we engage with metaverse avatars, where my research is based, well, actually, I'm engaging with the real person behind it. But then if I'm engaging an avatar that is a deathbot or ghostbot, well, actually, they don't exist. They're just a machine with a person. And then, of course, duplicates, something like ABBA, who have digital duplicates, who you engage with, the real person or just their duplicate. And again, when we look, and we're going to think about gaze in a minute, but when we think about gaze, we're saying, well, is it a one-way gaze? The gaze is unidirectional, with no reflection of the human-divine relationship. A two-way gaze, a mutual exchange between humans and robots, suggesting a more profound relational dynamic. Or perhaps there's just a partial reflection. The robot mirrors aspects of the human-divine relationship, but cannot fully embody the image of humanity. So what about gazing? What is our understanding of gazing? Again, it's another word that is interchangeable. The Cambridge Dictionary describes gazing as to look at something or someone for a long time, especially in surprise or adoration. This will indicate there's always two parts to the gaze. There's the person looking and the individual or item being looked at. If we consider Buber's terms, there needs to be an I, the person gazing, and then a you or an it. And this could be described as relationship actions, however brief. And although the word gaze is linked to looking, from a definition, it appears that it's looking for a longer time, there seems to be a period attached to this looking. I mean, I look at a bus timetable to find when the next bus comes, but I might gaze at the sunset, enjoying the warmth or the vibrant colours that is there. And if we look into scripture and how the word again there is used interchangeably, Maria Maguire speaks in Genesis 1 about the Hebrew word used, ria, which means to give attention or keep on looking. God is the original gazer who looks at the world with divine eyes and declares that it is very good. In Psalm 139, the Hebrew word used here means to see through one's innermost beings. When the psalmist cries, you probe me and you know me, it is a recognition that God looks deeply into his heart and understands all that they are. So there's different connotations of gaze. And then what does it mean to gaze, to give attention? Again, it would appear in one instance there's both a downward trajectory from God and an upward one from humanity. However, there's also a horizontal gaze between humans, which can be good, but also challenging. Jürgen Moltmann speaks about how the Christian faith is developed by gazing on the suffering and crucified God. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer suggests that Christians develop their faith by fixing their gaze on the strange place in the world at which they perceive, astonish the breaking of the curse, the resurrection of Jesus. And yet not all gazes are perhaps good. Several theologians mention the patriarchal male gaze. Rachel Myers describes Karl Barth's relationship with his assistant Charlotte von Kirschbaum as a patriarchal male gaze, the gaze that fixes the woman as an object of male evaluation. And yet, as in that relationship, perhaps the gaze is one of power. But the gaze can also be one of power, can't we? From teacher to a student, pastor to a member of their congregation, law enforcement to someone they're engaging with. Bell Hooks speaks about the gaze has been and is a societal resistance for colonised black people globally. Subordinates in relation of power learn experimentally. There is a critical gaze, one that looks to document, one that is oppositional, one that is from a position of power. So we can see these practices in relation to the human-robot relationship. There's a power relationship. If Alexa annoys me, well, I just turn her off, turn the power. If it's a robot, well, perhaps I'd switch it off or do something else. But what about a theological interpretation? It can be described in several ways, this word gaze, but there appears to be this steadfast looking. As we have said, it's to describe God looking down at humanity, as in Genesis 1 or the Psalms, and then as humanity looking at God or his creation. Patrick Stokes describes it as an evaluative gaze, which according to Søren Kierkegaard looks straight into one's heart. Of course, there's a constant looking at one another, perhaps when people first meet, perhaps when they fall in love, perhaps with the partner, a horizontal gaze. But even for this type of gaze, it could be argued there needs to be something to be looked at. It's not a random act as looking for a lost coin, but a definite one. Kierkegaard speaks about the upward gaze, focusing on God, despite the person's own situation. And it is this upward gaze that provides the daily peace and security. Karl Barth talks about the gaze should always be on God, and then later speaks about the gaze being directed on the Son of Man, Jesus. And Barth says, well, this gaze should not be allowed to wander, but to be constantly on the Saviour. Because if it gaze wanders, then the person has a divided heart, not wholly committed to God, according to Barth. And yet he sees this gaze as an upward sign, a positive sign of building a relationship. The gaze is part of the relationship building, either with one with another or one with our spiritual father, or however people want to describe God. Like Kierkegaard, Barth speaks about the downward gaze, that God's gaze is eternally fastened on what we are and will do and do not do. Yet often we have to gaze backwards to understand the present or the future. What about robots? What do they do? Do they gaze at us lovingly? Is Alexa gazing at me or listening to me lovingly when I'm giving her the instructions? Julie Carpenter's book, The Naked Android, she uses the term human gaze, which she suggests is the way we watch over people, how they behave, to model our own behaviour, and we imagine an improved life. And she develops in her book how AI, or how this human gaze reflects our relationship with robots and AI. This could be described as the horizontal gaze, when we gaze at each other. Eric Stoddart, in his book The Common Gaze, describes this as surveillance for the common good, infected with a preferential optic for those who are digitally poor. This common gaze is replicated by the other, although depending on the context of the gaze, it could be what Bell Hooks describes as the oppositional gaze. And of course, we live in a surveillance society where there are cameras more or less everywhere, gazing at us, watching our every being. But Carpenter speaks about this human gaze, suggesting that we learn and develop by how others behave, and this shapes their own development. The human gaze refers to the position of artificial intelligence to humans, and using human-like paradigms of understanding the world as AI research and development models, especially robots. It is humanity's positioning of their sense of the self in relation to social robots and the realization of the self for a new ontological gaze, that she says. Can robots learn from us? Well, how do we learn? In one sense, we learn from what's already known, and then we develop it and learn more. We try and we experiment. Are we actually any different from robots? I would suggest that AI and robots learn from how we have behaved in the past. And of course, the data that's entered can influence the outcome, especially with those large language models, which use past data to make present time assumptions. Of course, we are very aware of the stereotyping and other things that go on. However, could a robot develop knowledge through human interaction? In its early days, I asked ChatGPT why Karl Barth was called the Red Pastor. And its answer was, well, he was never called the Red Pastor. However, I was able to point out to ChatGPT they were wrong, and that he had been called the Red Pastor when he was at Safenville in the 1920s, and actually could provide them the reference for it. Therefore, ChatGPT was able to update its knowledge from my gaze. And yet, Carpenter says that humans bear this gaze by default. But also, they say what is different between us and robots is we have this divine spark. As we are created in the image of God, we have the breath of God, she says, in us. The robots lack the divine spark. But she says within her book that this is the difference. Humans are the bearers of the gaze by default. That as humans, we assume rights and cultural privileges over the robot. And society agrees with this assumption. The value of a robot is determined by its appeal and use to humans, thus reducing robots to objects for human utility. If I want to hoover my house, my friend has got a robot vacuum cleaner and named him after a footballer. Me, I go to the cupboard and get the vacuum cleaner out because I don't see the point of having one. So its value is determined by how much we want to use it. And yet, when we look at robots, Scott Midson suggests that the robot is likely to be similar to human, as it has many features based on the human ones, and describes a robotic gaze as representing the human, where here the emphasis may lie in the representation, which is both faithful to and distortive of the original. The robot's eyes may see and record everything, as based on the concept of human eyes, which see and record everything. Although downloading a robot's memory is probably a lot more easier than trying to download ours. Although Noreen Hertzfeld outlines the difference here, is that a robot may be able to look us in the eye, but we know there is no one at home beyond that gaze. And of course, Noreen is building on Barth's criteria in Church Dogmatics for a relationship, where he states it's necessary to have eye contact, to look the other in the eye. And perhaps it is demonstrated in the metaverse, where an avatar can look another avatar in the eye, but the actual controller can only see the other avatar. It cannot see the controller behind the avatar. There's no direct gaze between the two people, but between the avatars. And if a robot doesn't have emotion, can it even gaze? As I've indicated there, linking to the looking part is an emotional attachment, whether an adoration of a person's style, the wonder of a sunset, or even frustration at their actions. A robot cannot duplicate this, the feeling side. It can duplicate perhaps the look in and the amazement on the face side, but it can't have the emotions. Maybe the program can provide an answer, but there's no conscience or feeling, which picks up on work by other scholars. An interesting subject, but time does not allow us to develop. So in conclusion, Ola Sigurdsson says that the gaze becomes a vehicle for the whole body. And it's not just the eyes that are involved, but the whole body. The gaze often develops with relationship. And as our speakers highlighted yesterday, what is our relationship with AI, robots or avatars? Is it master, tool, servant or partner? The stage of the relationship may have indications for the implication of a gaze. We had three options. I argue that the gaze is only one, from human to the robot. The robot is a tool. It can look, but there's nothing behind the gaze. There's no mutual exchange, and it does not partially reflect the human-divine relationship. The lack of the divine spark prevents that. So we started thinking about gaze and its impact on us and what we gaze on. Our gaze focuses on other people, whether we want a physique or clothes, or be famous or studious as them. However, we could argue that we're all made in God's image as unique individuals and have a different gaze. As Martin Heidegger states, the correctness of the gaze, it becomes a characteristic of human comportment towards being. Well, according to ChatGPT, this means the gaze relates to one another as human beings, something ChatGPT or similar things or robots or avatars cannot do. Thank you.